It's now my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of the next panel, who will then in turn introduce the fellow panelists. Michael Jones is the pro bono president of the Maritime Alliance since it was created in 2007. The mission of the Alliance is to promote blue technology and blue jobs, and we've heard a lot about that over the past couple of sessions, and we'll hear more about it next. The Alliance is focused on the San Diego Maritime Technology Cluster, but its goals and its reach go far beyond the region to national and international levels. And with that, let me introduce Michael.
So Jason, thank you, and the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation for what a terrific event. It's my first time here, and I've made some great contacts and learned an awful lot, so thank you very much. We started yesterday with the Department of Commerce Secretary Bryson talking about the blue economy. You heard Jason just said that we're focused on promoting blue tech and blue jobs. This panel is called The Ocean Connection, Economic Prosperity in Times of Change, which I think is another way of saying the blue economy. What we're going to do is start with two historians to give us context and emphasize the second part of that, the economic prosperity in times of change up to today. Then we'll pivot to talk two presentations on new opportunities in blue tech. So I'm going to very quickly introduce the four panelists. Obviously, their full bios are in the presentation material you have. Dr. Joe Roman is with the Gund Institute for Ecological Economics, University of Vermont. He's been most recently a Fulbright scholar or student in Brazil. We've recently been on Skype with him. He's going to talk nominally about what's a whale worth, how ocean industry adapts to new economic realities. Very interesting topic. Dr. John Oden Jensen, our second historian, will talk about, with the Maritime Studies faculty at Sea Education Association. We'll talk about delivering American prosperity, transportation revolutions on the maritime frontier. Then we get to some of the newer technologies. Mark-Ian Melnick, the president of Atlantic Wind Connection, will talk about building an offshore wind industry. And then finally, last but not least, since we're both from San Diego and brought you guys wonderful weather yesterday, Don Kent from Hub Seawall Research Institute in San Diego is going to talk about innovation for food security, incubating new aquaculture technologies. So, Joe?
Great. Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you very much, Senator Begich, as well. Let's see. So, for much of human history, this is all we would have known of what a whale looked like. It would have been a spout that split the horizon, then we would have seen a smaller blow or spout, and then for the most buoyant of whales, you might have a fluke, and it goes and disappears beneath the surface of the sea. So we really didn't know what a whale looked like for millions of years for people who lived along the coast, for hundreds of thousands of years. This fostered lots of speculation about what life was like beneath the sea. Not only, and in that way, I think whales are a very good metaphor for the oceans in general, for our understanding of the oceans in general. We really had that very limited understanding, and that allowed us to imagine what was going on beneath the sea. The mythical sea creature at the bottom of your slide there was actually based on a mistranslation. It was known as a leviathan between Swedish and Latin. The mistranslation for claws, from fins to claws. People thought that these were that whales had claws, and even though no one ever saw a whale with claws, it persisted in the literature for centuries. Also, there was the idea that the oceans were boundless. That is, there were no boundaries and they were limitless, and this persisted for decades as well. There was one way that we could see a whale up close, and that's when they stranded. This is from a 1600 print from the Netherlands, and it shows a sperm whale. It shows the reaction. People were fascinated by these organisms when they washed up, but they were also nervous. Father Time is on the upper edge of this slide, and if you could see close enough, his time is running out. The sand is running out. It's auguring disaster. There's something wrong with the natural order when whales start showing up, when sea creatures start showing up on land. Of course, we did do this on purpose We did bring whales onto shore on purpose, starting commercially about 1000 AD. The Basques in Europe started hunting the North Atlantic right whale. That's the right whale up there. Initially, they were hunted for their meat and largely for the tongue. Whales were considered fish, so they could be eaten during Lent. So they were hunted at that time and sold as a delicacy. They were also used for the baleen that you can see on the upper side of that slide, the baleen plates, something like early spring steel or early plastics used in bedding, for fishing rods, for umbrellas, for various products. Populations along the coast of a lot of these species started to decline in the early 1800s. Here in the United States, we started a new fishery for the larger odontocetes, the toothed whales, in particular sperm whales, shown here at the bottom. That began off Nantucket in the beginning of the 18th century. They were largely hunted for oil, to light the night. They lit lighthouses, street lights, writers' garrets. Basically, it was the way to keep working through the evening. Now, whereas the main product for sperm whales was designed for that, the main product for baleen whales, for right whales, never saw the light of day. That would have been women's corsets. Started in the 1550s by Mary Tudor, Queen of England. She, to crimp the waists of young girls. Catherine de' Medici got wind of this fashion. She didn't want to be outdone. She was the Queen of France, didn't want to be outdone by a Briton in the realm of fashion. She declared that the ideal waist was 13 inches, about the size of a CD. That was the ideal waist size for women at that time. This resulted, as you could imagine, in broken ribs and lots of damage to women at that time. The fashion continued about until the 1860s or so, maybe even into a little bit later, when people finally stopped wearing them. As bad as it was for women, it was worse for the whale. At the peak of Yankee whaling, 5 million pounds of baleen was coming in every year into American ports. This is the Arctic Oil Works in San Francisco shown here, and this is the baleen from bowhead whales in the North Pacific. That populations quickly declined for lots of these species. For the North Atlantic right whale, then the northern species, and then the species in the southern hemisphere. It was worth a lot of money. It was bringing in $2 million a year. That was a lot of money at the time. It was valuable, but populations began to decline around the 1870s. Also, the discovery of petroleum around that time provided another resource. So the whaling industry, at least in the United States, started to decline around that time. That doesn't mean that whaling ended. The 20th century, whaling was extensive, not so much by the United States at this time, but by lots of other countries, particularly Norway, Soviet Union, Japan. The US was still a partner in that as well. What you see in this slide is the serial depletion of different species. We went after the largest species, the ones that were most valuable, the blue whale in the 1920s. When they declined, fin whales, then humpbacks, and finally the smallest species, the minkies, were hunted in the 1980s. This was really the method. You go after the most valuable one and you work your way down. We see that in lots of other fisheries as well. You can also see the results of an oil glut in the 1930s, as well as the Great Depression. And then in the 1940s, the whale ships were taken out and they were used for military projects, either to hunt submarines, or they were also used to launch small planes against Pearl Harbor in the 1940s. The Japanese used these to launch some of their small planes. So by the 1980s, the world was faced with a choice. Whether continue whaling, that is, most whales were already depleted to commercial extinction, but now we were really facing not only ecological extinction, but true extinction for these species. Some of the countries that continued to whale argued to keep it open. Japan, Soviet Union, Norway in particular, argued to keep it open. Other countries, a lot of the English-speaking countries, led in large part by the United States, argued for a moratorium, stop commercial whaling completely. This was the argument at that time. 1980s, a commercial moratorium is put in, and whales are protected. They're still hunted, in part for sustainable for local hunting, as in Alaska, and they're also hunted in Japan of what they call scientific whaling. There was a major shift at this time in the United States, though, and I think in part it was we started to explore what was going on beneath the surface of the ocean, really start to understand whales, how they acted culturally and ecologically. This was in part because of using sonar, and also the Jacques Cousteau and the use of scuba allowed us to understand what the sounds that were going on and also how whales interacted. The idea that whales were gentle giants instead of monsters of the sea, there was something we could actually understand and enjoy. And a new industry started a little bit earlier in the United States, that is whale watching. It's now a $2 billion a year industry around the world. 119 countries have whale watching. Started in 1955 off San Diego. In the US alone, it's almost $1 billion a year industry. This provides diversity of jobs for areas that have been impacted by declines in fisheries and allows for a different understanding of the whales. This whale here, the gray whale, was known to whalers as the devilfish because it used to attack their ships when they harpooned it. Their young, of course, that you could understand that response. Now the young and the mothers off Baja California come up to the boat, so they've changed their behavior. We're also starting to understand the ecology of whales, and this is some of the research that I've been involved with in recent years. Not only are they important culturally to us, they're also essential to the oceans. They provide nutrients in areas where they are found by diving deep to feed, coming up to the surface where they excrete nutrients and increase productivity. You can have more whales and more fish in areas, and whales can increase the resilience in areas where they're found by pumping these nutrients to the surface. Keep in mind, though we don't intentionally whale anymore, we do still whale. It's indirect now, though. Whales get caught in fisheries, entangled in fisheries. They also get hit by ships. This is a grave concern for highly endangered species such as the North Atlantic right whale. Only 400 left, one of them shown here, hit by a ship. Good news is, there have been changes, particularly off the coast of Massachusetts, also off the coast of Nova Scotia. What was done was originally, if you can see that, the solid line that's going just off Cape Cod there, that was the original shipping lane for going into Boston. Right through, the red area is the area where there is a dense population of right whales and humpback whales, went right through the middle of there, causing ship strikes. Workers at the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary proposed moving that shipping lane to the area where there were fewest whales feeding in the springtime. It's resulted, they predicted it would result in a reduction of ship strikes of about 60%. The numbers that I've read most recently, 80% reduction in ship strikes. So this was one really successful move to protect some of the most endangered animals on the planet. To wrap up, whale recovery can restore the oceans and also support a sustainable economy. I've discussed whale watching. Lots of money comes in for stewardship to protect species from strandings. Whales also enhance biodiversity in areas where they're found, and they increase community structure. Amazingly, some calculations show that they sequester lots of carbon. When a whale dies, it falls to the bottom of the ocean, so they're important, just like trees, in keeping carbon out of the atmosphere, and they can increase productivity and resilience in areas where they're found. Thank you.
I'd like to start off by thanking the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation for this opportunity to come to Capital Oceans Week. It's a real honor. and also to join with you folks in recognizing the 40th anniversary of America's National Marine Sanctuary Program. Try to think about this as a historian. Historians are all about trying to understand and extract meaning from the process of change. And this sanctuary program that the foundation supports really was born out of a new interest in the ocean that was in itself a product of really a set of things that came out of technology and the legacy of 2 global wars. In the years after World War II, we developed a new understanding and a new appreciation, and it really came from technology and a linkage of imagination and technology. And in fact, the creation, and I'm a little confused here on my buttons, sorry about that. The creation and marriage of new technologies, such as the underwater camera and the aqualung, was inspired in some ways by long-held and sometimes fanciful notions of the ocean, and embraced by oral, literary, and popular culture traditions. And if we look at Verne and Cousteau, we see imagination meeting the ocean through the medium of technology. And this creates a new era in ocean use and ocean meaning. It was born with a promise to feed the world, to create new sources of power in society, and to perpetuate a national legacy of intrepid explorers. If we're thinking about how this nation was shaped by the sea, these ideas, these cultural ideas, are really important. The idea of frontier is critical to any shaping, understanding of shaping of the nation. And perhaps no idea conveys American historical identity more directly than that of the frontier. And in our world, in the American story, this tends to be considered a terrestrial story. We're looking at a pretty famous picture here, John Gast's 1872 American Progress. And we think about the frontier in terms of land, in terms of westward expansion, of moving, of intrepid destiny moving westward. It's a terrestrial story. The wagon train, followed by the plow. All of these things certainly occurred, but they also occurred within a great maritime context, and that's much of what I'm going to talk about here for the next few minutes. The real record, the maritime cultural landscape that we are exploring increasingly, records and reveals a much more complicated story, even in the American heartland, and that's the focus here. Places like Ohio, places like Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, places where millions of Americans who never taste the salt of the sea live. This maritime story is powerful and profound. For even in the heartland, we find ourselves as one nation shaped by the sea. The western frontier was a maritime frontier. It was an evolving region, and it was a set of processes that brought together some of America's strongest entrepreneurs, its most creative people, its most adventurous people. And that was, of course, the maritime people, the people of the East Coast and of the Gulf, the people who were used to thinking expansively and beyond their own borders. I'm going to lay out one brief example of how these people shaped or reshaped our country. But before I do that, I want to think a little bit about this notion of frontiers. And the image that I have up, we'll lay out this for a second. What you're looking at there are two people, two related people. On the lower end, it's Donald Mackay, perhaps the most famous shipbuilder in America in the 19th century, famous for the clipper ships, icons across the world. Above the schooner Lumberman, a humble thing that's sitting on the bottom of Lake Michigan, and its builder, Alan Litchfield. As we look at the shaping of America and figuring these things out, it turns out people like Alan Litchfield, a maritime person, a brother-in-law of Donald Mackay, was one of thousands of maritime people who moved west because of the frontier possibilities. And so again, I want to think about frontiers just for a second. What is, in fact, a frontier? Conceptually, it has a lot of things that lead to creativity, but also bring chaos. A frontier in this maritime context is a place where the perceptions of possibility exceed the availability of knowledge. Think about that magic of the ocean as people first experienced it, and the promise that was unveiled as we saw new things. This frontier was a place, and is a place, where limits have yet to be defined. We don't know the scope and limits, and that, of course, inspires us to do more. The frontier was, and it remains, a place where old rules or traditions are called into question and sometimes dismissed. This allows things to move fast. It's a place, or it was in the 19th century, and to an extent in the 20th century, and as we move out into the high seas, still is a place where formal authority is weak or in flux. And it's a place where new or adapted technologies or forms of human organization are used to unlock the potential. So frontiers, this notion of frontiers, is critical to the past and into our future sense of progress. Now, as a place and as a process, the frontier, it promises chances for great rewards and, of course, can result in terrible harm. And this is this balance that people in the past and the present have struggled with and that we are moving toward in the future. Now, the place that I have worked a lot with in terms of the sanctuaries is the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary in Alpena, Michigan. It's a place where there's over 100 historic shipwrecks in the middle of the country, beautifully preserved. And we have to ask the question, why are they there? Why are they there? These ships look like something that came out of Massachusetts or London. Why are they there? Well, when we peel back the lens and we see this larger world, we find a set of lakes that aren't lakes at all. In fact, they're connected to the global ocean. But they weren't that way naturally. They had some connections. This idea of a true integrated sea was a human creation. One that in the 19th century, entrepreneurs changed how landforms worked through locks that connected up lake and river and literally created a sea in a place where there had been none. Technology, the technological response starts with canals. This, of course, is the Erie Canal, opens in 1825, that in many ways creates the New York that we know, for example. This is an image related to that. It's a medallion, and it shows two gentlemen with a lot of hair and a pitchfork sitting next to each other. But if we look deeper, it conveys something really important. We have Pan on the one side looking at the promise and possibility of the terrestrial environment, of agriculture, of this expanding frontier as we think about it, linked with Neptune and the god of the sea, because the understanding of the entrepreneurs and the people shaping American destiny in the 19th century really saw that to have an America that was powerful, connected, and democratic, the land had to meet the sea in very interconnected ways. And they do this by reshaping the region and creating a sea where there had been no sea before. We can see some other images of that develop this more closely. The 19th century, the mid part of the 19th century, was a time of transportation revolutions. Canals, steamboats, railroad trains knitted this nation together. But technology came in different packages. This is an 1837 image of an entrance to a contest to create a territorial seal for the state of Wisconsin. It took second place. I liked it the best, actually. But if we look at the center of it, we look at these two pieces of technology. They look old to us. But in 1837, this was progress. You had a side wheel steamer blasting out that wood smoke in the middle, and down in front we have a plow, and not just any plow, the most cutting edge, literally, technology possible. It was a new kind of plow. And so it's an image, again, of this integration of land and sea, shaping and reshaping the land through a maritime and an agricultural imagination. And we see it today through places, let's say Chicago in 1850 and Chicago in the 21st century. All of this, in so many respects, were the product of this maritime imagination. Some things to draw back and think about. What is it about the sea, what it is about maritime people that have allowed them to exercise such an influence, not just on this country, but in the world? And I think there are some things that separate that out. One is that truly maritime people, at least in the modern global sense, and even closer than that, have an extraordinary capacity to see and recognize connectivity. To see that by connecting two places or three places together, you can create more than these places just being on their own. They also, certainly in the 19th century and other places, developed the capacity to transform the marine environment to meet human needs. Now, this was not always a good thing, but it is a sense of power and capacity. They also had an ability, and I think this is really important for us as modern maritime people, is to have the ability to envisage and create a world that's profoundly different than the present. Going back to this idea of the Great Lakes and the maritime frontier of the Midwest in America, it started out as a distant place of disconnected bodies of water, far from anywhere. But people, generation after generation, saw the potential to make a sea where one had never been before, to connect it up into the global world, and the result, of course, was a century of American dominance in industry, of tremendous capacity in agriculture, and all of that. So, takeaway lesson. I think that as we work as people who are interested in preserving and using and maintaining our connections with the sea, as maritime people, we can think about using this to blaze a trail to a new and profoundly better ocean frontier, one that's defined by cultural, environmental, and economic sustainability. So these lessons of the past, this flexibility, this creativity, this connectivity can come together to envision a world that's different than what we've had and to take steps to move forward in the future. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Martin Melnick.
Thanks, John. Well, we heard some really interesting history, and what struck me was the past view of the world oceans as boundless. But today, when we look out at the ocean, we also see competing users everywhere. And so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how siting is an issue that we work to manage. And one example of siting is Cape Wind. I think a lot of people are familiar with the Cape Wind story. And that's a story of more than 10 years of battles over siting. So how do we avoid that if we're going to have a successful ocean industry or offshore wind industry? This map is population overlaid with wind. And the bright colors are strong winds, population, the dark dots. And you see there's a whole lot of offshore wind in the Midwest. That technology is quite advanced. It's cost effective. But to bring that power to the load centers requires substantial amounts of transmission. And offshore, we've got strong winds, population nearby. And politicians up and down the coast want to use their energy demand to help create jobs. So there's a strong driver to use that local resource to create economic development. What's the technology that will be used to go offshore? Well, it's an extension. It starts as an extension of what we know on land. These foundations that are sunk into the land, we move that into shallow waters and put those in the seabed. But what you see in that photo is also machines that are getting larger and larger. The blade on the bottom left is from a Vestas 7 megawatt turbine. It's the length of 9 London buses. So that's just one turbine. Think of a rotor diameter that's two of those blades wide. And what that, the import of that is, on land, we can move machines, but we're limited by roadways, bridges, tunnels, the ability to get up into the mountains with these machines. That limits the size of the machines we can use. In the wide open spaces of the ocean, we can magnify the size of the machine, capture a whole lot more wind. Now there's a lot on this slide, but I want to focus in on those blue lines. What this is Department of Energy's projection for how offshore wind technology can decrease in cost. And in the blue, you see a transition over time from smaller turbines to larger turbines, from smaller rotor diameters to larger rotor diameters. Now I have 2 girls in the 6th grade, and they're learning how to tell areas and such. And they can tell me that the area of a circle is pi r squared. Take that radius, you square it. So the rotor swept area of a turbine increases by the square of the radius. And that means the power production increases exponentially when you can make a bigger machine. That's a big part of driving down the cost of offshore wind, using the scale of the ocean to use bigger and bigger machines. Now, our business is not building offshore wind turbines. It's building the transmission highway to get that power efficiently to the users on land. Now, back in the late 1800s, when electricity was first starting in the US, we had a really fantastic battle between the Wizard of Menlo Park, Thomas Edison down there, George Westinghouse, the Pittsburgh industrial magnate. And Edison started electricity with direct current technology, but it had a key limitation, which is it was hard to change voltages. And Westinghouse was able to surpass him. And the reason changing voltages was so important is because if you couldn't generate in large-scale plants and serve a big area, you had to have a lot of little plants, and that was quite expensive. What Westinghouse did was he used alternating current, and he could build things like hydroelectric power plants in Niagara Falls, move that power long distances to places like Buffalo that were industrial centers at the time. Now, had Edison had he had what we have today, which is semiconductors that can condition power, he would have been able to use DC technology much more efficiently, and that's what we're doing today for offshore wind. The old way of connecting offshore wind is each wind farm developer builds their own farm, and they build their own transmission line to the coastal grid. The coast is not that populated. The transmission lines right along the coast tend to be fairly weak. So you send a variable resource like wind, and you have it absorbed by a weak grid right along the coast. Also, you've got that transmission line, but it's only being used when the wind is blowing. So it's underutilized. With the Atlantic Wind Connection, we're saying connect multiple offshore wind farms into a grid offshore. And take that variability that you get from the individual wind farms and let's blend it together so you get lower aggregate variability. And then when the wind's not blowing, because the weather's calm, you move conventional power on the system, and you're able to fill in the valleys of production in wind power with conventional power and deliver firm energy. So you can help support grid reliability. You can help use the existing generation network more efficiently. So you get twice as much utilization out of a system. And why is that so important? Why is this balancing variability so important? Because electricity is not a typical commodity. Ice cream. I can make ice cream all winter long and store it in a freezer so when it's hot in July and demand is high, we have plenty of ice cream. Electricity has to be made the instant it's needed. And you have to maintain that constant balance between generation and load. And the bigger and more connected your grid is, the better you're able to do that. Just a few things. I started by saying siting is key, so I wanted to explain how we help address siting. This is a map of cost of offshore wind. We looked at wind speeds and we looked at cost of building structures in the ocean, and that's principally driven by foundation costs, which is driven by water depths. The further out you go, the more expensive the machine is, and you get some additional wind production because the winds tend to get stronger offshore, but not enough to offset the foundation costs. If you were to site wind farms, you'd site them up towards New York City in that harbor area because it's close to the load and the costs are low. But to avoid conflicts, we've described these polygons, which are areas that are lower conflicts for offshore wind, and that's where we're putting them. So there's the need to minimize conflicts. You need to provide transmission to get the power where it's most valuable. We did a very extensive GIS analysis of conflicts, we looked at several layers, and this is the first layer where conflicts that preclude offshore wind, like shipping lanes, are considered. And then we looked at other conflicts that would influence siting, make permitting harder. And when we layer those all together, we get results that are very similar to the wind energy areas that the Department of Interior found were low conflict zones. Our project is funded by a variety of investors. One of them that's not that well known is Elia. They're Belgium's high voltage transmission operator, and they're very active in building transmission for offshore wind in Europe. So we're glad to have them as part of our team. And I'm going to wrap up by bringing history back into the conversation. Offshore wind, they're machines. We know how to make machines. The more of them we make, the better we get at it. And this is Henry Ford, one of America's great industrialists. He was able to take his Model T, introduce it at over $800 a car. By the time it was leaving production, it was less than $400 a car. At the same time, he was paying his workers more than average industrial wages, to the point where other factory owners were angry at him. But he was smart enough to understand that with skilled workers that he could retain, he got greater productivity. And those workers then turned around and were able to buy his products. So we have a recipe, an example of how to make a successful industry in offshore wind. We can start small and start that to learn from manufacturing, integrate it with our grid slowly and the existing resources we have, and provide the jobs and economic stability that we're looking for. So I'd like to introduce Don Kent to take the podium.
Boy, that's kind of down there, isn't it? Okay. Thank you, Markian. I'm going to talk a little bit about aquaculture, and I'd like to talk about innovation, but the reality is we've been doing aquaculture for about 5,000 years. So what we're really talking about doing is applying existing technologies in a new way. Now, I'm a native San Diegan. When I was growing up, tuna boats were stacked 3 deep down in our Embarcadero area. And Southern California was the fishing capital of the world. And we supported over 10,000 fishery jobs, cannery jobs from the tuna industry. But by 1994, that industry had disappeared. And we're down to about 500 industry jobs in tuna, mostly on hook and line tuna. Now, some of the other traits that have been going on in California, this is actually a catch of what was sold as Pacific rockfish. And it's actually a mix of about 40 different species of the genus Sebastes, rockfish, like cabezon and not cabezon, cow cod and picacho. And each one of those species requires a certain amount of management. So what we've seen between in 10 years from 1997 to 2007, along the entire Pacific coast of the U.S., this is Washington, Oregon, and California combined, is dropping from about 50 million pounds of production to less than a couple million pounds. And you can see the commensurate decrease in value to the fishery and the jobs related to that. And what we see happening is a trend. This is from NOEP, National Ocean Economic Program funded by NOAA. And we looked over between 1990 and 2000 the loss of quite a few jobs in the fishing industry. So these were folks that made their living either catching the fish or processing it and distributing it. And to support these industries, initially we developed a lot of infrastructure. This is San Diego Bay. You can see 2 commercial basins here that we have that are used to offload fish. Now, total catch for all of San Diego County, we have 3 small ports, well, 2 small ports and 1 large one, San Diego, was 1,000 tons a year. And that was made up mostly of our lobsters, our spiny lobsters, sea urchins for the sushi trade, and swordfish. But nothing like what the tuna industry used to bring in. 1,000 tons is what one tuna seining boat would bring in on one trip. So the volume has dropped dramatically. And so how can we utilize this existing infrastructure? Because once we lose it, it's gone forever. They're going to, if we lose that commercial basin, they're going to put up a Hyatt hotel or a Charger stadium, which is what everybody wants to do. I don't know why they want to keep putting football next to the ocean, but go figure. Now, we put that in the context of what the demands are for seafood. Now, this is global. This comes from the NOAA Aquaculture Office. And what we're estimating is if we keep fishery production globally consistent, that's the pink column there, and then fish meal harvest, which is the yellow area, the increased demand for seafood based on population growth over the next 20, 30 years is going to mean that we need about another 40 to 50 million metric tons a year. Now, to give you a perspective on that, commercial salmon farming, or not farming, but fishing in the Pacific Northwest is about 3 million metric tons a year. So we're talking about tenfold or greater capacity than one of the largest fisheries we have. So where's that going to come from? Well, right now, it's coming from aquaculture. Over half the production of seafood in the world comes from aquaculture, and this is a sort of a dramatization of where that's coming from. By and large, the greatest production is in China and Asia combined. About 80% of the world production from aquaculture comes from that part of the world. 50% of the world's supply is cultured, and 85% of our seafood supply for this country comes from importation from other parts of the world. So a large part of what we're eating in seafood is coming from other parts of the world, and we're accepting it, we're buying it according to the standards they use in producing. Now, this is a farm in China that's producing fish, and this isn't what any one of us would envision we want to see if we went out on the Chesapeake Bay or off of Cape Cod or off of Southern California. We love our coastline, we want to preserve it, but there are technologies available that allow us to get further offshore and not be reliant on embayments. But this type of production is what we want to try to avoid. And what we also want to grow seafood under our own standards. I don't know if you remember a few years ago in 2008, there was a story about a toxic material getting into fish food, melamine. And what the folks would do is they would grind that up and put it in the fish food, and would artificially increase, it would make chemists think that the protein content in the seafood, in the fish food, was higher. You may have heard about this getting into dog food. Mm-hmm. There was a series of stories about animals that were being poisoned here in the U.S. because of this material being added by the Chinese into foodstuffs that we use for pet food. It even got into baby formula in China and killed some infants. So if we're going to eat more seafood, and I think we are, we're either going to buy it from whoever will grow it and sell it to us, or we're going to grow it ourselves into our following our own standards. And as I said, the technology exists. This is an open ocean farm off of Mexico. You can set these up in grid systems such that you've got a farm as depicted in that drawing there is about a 3,000 ton capacity. The cages are about anywhere from 25 to 40 meters across, and they'll stand up to 30-foot seas. And this technology is certainly not a limiting factor for us. This is a recent publication late last year that was used Google Earth to verify farm production estimates from the FAO in the Mediterranean. And each one of those dots along the 16 countries that border the Mediterranean are locations for fish farms. Now, the European Union has some of the most stringent importation restrictions for seafood of anywhere. And so the conditions for the environment, the conditions for the production of seafood in some of these countries is going to be just as high as anything we'd want to see. So what's limiting us right now in production? Is it a function of working capital? So to give a rough estimate, I'm not going to read all this, but one of the concerns that we have is even some of the places we're getting seafood from now may disappear. Right now, about 25% of the world's middle class lives in China or in Asia. It's estimated in the next 20 years it'll be 66%. So all that seafood they're producing, they're going to keep. They're not going to sell it to us. The 500,000 metric tons of salmon produced in Chile is going to stay in South America because the Brazilian economy can afford it now. So what's going on is that in air freighting that salmon up here from Chile, we're spending another $160 million a year for that salmon that we wouldn't have to spend if we grew it here. And it would be $130 million of revenue in the core price of buying that salmon that would also stay in this country. So to do that type of production and duplicate it here in the U.S. would take about 691 surface acres, and that would be about 0.06% of Puget Sound in Washington State. So as another example, this is what happens. That area in the red rectangle is Southern California's yield. It's about 100,000 metric tons a year, not very much production. And it's all gathered from about 19,000 square miles off the coast, and it's worth about $59 million ex-vessel, which means that each one of those square miles is worth about $3,000 in harvest. Now, to do the equivalent amount of fish production in cages would require an area about the size of that green dot, or about 20 square miles, with the farms spread quite a bit apart from one another. And that would be about $30 million per square mile of production capacity and produce about 4,000 jobs for the Southern California seafood industry. Now we compare that with existing marine protected areas that we already have around our Channel Islands and the new ones that I don't show here that are being established in Southern California. And you see the space is comparable to some of the size of some of these. I'm going to have to rush through this. So what limits us? This is a listing of all the requirements you would have to fulfill to put a cage farm in Puget Sound. And this is a listing of the 2-year process we'd have to go through if we wanted to put a cage operation out in the exclusive economic zone in the United States. So it would take about 2 years and cost about $1 million, assuming there weren't a lot of lawsuits associated with that. So in Mexico, by comparison, this is a listing of about 12 different farms in Mexico that want to purchase fish to go into their farming operations. It takes about 6 weeks to 6 months to get a permit down there, and for upwards of 10,000 tons of production. So when you talk about the economics of this, you have to put into part of that as being the capacity to get out and have a reliable permitting process to go through. Now, there's a lot of concern about the development of aquaculture and impacts on the environment, both direct and indirect. And here's a recent report, a quote from it that came out from Conservation International World Fish, and basically stating that fish production, protein production by aquaculture is the most ecologically sound manner that we have available to us in the production of protein. Far better than chicken, beef, terrestrial farming, and fishing. So with that, I'd like to leave it with just a couple of quotes. One from Captain Cousteau in the 1970s, "We must learn to farm the sea as we farm the land." And another quote from President Obama when he addressed Congress, "I do not accept a future where the jobs and industries of tomorrow take root beyond our borders. It is time for America to lead again." With that, I thank you very much.
So great job, panel, staying on time. And we've got about 30 minutes. I'm going to take a minute and just talk a little bit about the Maritime Alliance, and then we're going to open it up for some questions. As I mentioned earlier, our tagline is promoting blue tech and blue jobs. We realized I was the CFO of an undersea robotics company, and the company grew from about $2 to $8 million in 4 years, and we make undersea tethered robots. Do a lot of work with aquaculture, for example. And realized at that time that the city had no idea that there was a maritime technology industry in San Diego. So we went to the Port of San Diego, we went to the Economic Development Corporation, and they had no knowledge that there was about 150 companies and institutions. And as we looked across the United States, we found basically the same thing. Whether you're in Seattle or you're in Boston or you're in Sydney, Australia, the maritime technology industry is basically invisible because typically they're selling between 1% and 2% locally, and the balance is sold all around the world. So we have basically popularized in San Diego what's going on and why this should be important. If you go back about 3 years ago, there was maritime, although San Diego, most people would say, is a Navy town. No one had realized that there was a maritime industry. Very strange, but it's true. Notwithstanding the fact we've got a big port there. So now, if you go onto the Economic Development Corporation's website, it says that maritime and maritime technology is an area of particular interest. Study was done in 2009. They're just doing an update right now, and we'll get the first results on June 26th when we do a cruise with the San Diego Regional Economic Development Corporation and the Workforce Partnership. There is no baseline to tell how many companies there are in the United States in maritime technology. There's no baseline to tell how many companies there are, even in San Diego. We keep finding them. The last study that was done, the first one that was done, came out, and to the great surprise of the city, there were $2 billion represented by the maritime industry, over 1,000 companies, 700 self-reported that they were majority revenue in maritime. We gave them a list of 100 maritime technology companies. We're now up to about 150. Within that $7+ billion, over $2 billion was maritime technology related. That was the high-tech sort. And that's growing very rapidly. So what we have found, while we are organizing the San Diego maritime technology community, we're really trying to help other groups around the United States. I told Senator Begich that we've been working with Southeastern Alaska to try and create a maritime technology community there. We recently, earlier this week, my executive director met with Lawrence Livermore National Labs and some economic development people in Northern California to talk about maybe creating a chapter there. So our hope is that we can work around the United States and try and create these hidden gems and bring them forward. One last comment from our point of view, we do work very heavily on ocean STEM, and we've just collaborated with the Maritime Museum of San Diego, and these are flyers for a magazine that will be given out on June 26th at this cruise. It's Maritime Technology Innovation in the Pacific, Past, Present, and Future. And this happens to be the Seabotics robot, tethered robot. But this is 154 pages focused on maritime technology. And we got Scripps Institution Oceanography, Spayware Systems Center, Oregon State, and University of Hawaii to all write articles about the importance of maritime technology and what it's meant to mankind. So looking back and looking forward. So this blue economy that we've been talking about, and again, kudos to the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation to be talking about this and bringing us all together. It is of enormous importance, and the last panel, Jim and Frank talked really great about technology, and I couldn't echo more their comments that this is just the beginning. There are hundreds of thousands of jobs that will be created in maritime technology. This country does not have a maritime technology policy. It's completely ignored it. We tried to get maritime technology recognized by the SBA, Department of Commerce, and they said that was the first person ever been there to talk about it. So, you know, this is really a virgin area, and I think what these four gentlemen have talked about, from a historical context, the changes that have taken place in these two new industries, are incredibly important for the future. So with that, I'd like to ask each of you, what misconception would you like to address related to your particular industry, or what happened in the past, and maybe even what policy changed the way the industry worked and made it better or worse?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the key misconceptions that we have about whales is that there are competitors. That is, that they extract fish or squid from the sea, and if we have too many whales, we're going to lose that. And the reality is it's much more complicated than that. We know that those prey populations were much higher in the past. We also know that whale populations were higher. We can see, because of these ecological relationships, that more whales actually add stability to populations and can also help increase productivity in those areas as well. So that's an ecological answer to your question, I think.
John?
Boy, that's a little tougher one when applied to me, because I'm not talking about a particular industry. But I think one misconception or thing that we've worked out, I was alluding to in my talk, is that when we think about the legacy of the United States and its maritime legacy, that it doesn't, that it's not just a coastal or a saltwater story. And I've worked for a good 20 years on and off, balancing between the Alaska and New England and Newfoundland and all of these places to just really follow those links to the heartland of the country. And so I guess what I would like to dispel is the idea that the ocean doesn't directly apply to the lives of Americans who aren't on the beach. We have ways of making that visible to them, and history is certainly one of them.
Well, I think one of the things we battle against is the conception that offshore wind is too expensive. And I'm not here to say that it's not going to start off expensive, but I think that there are a lot of creative ways with both policies and technologies to drive down the price. And one of the things we did was look at offshore wind as an integrated system. It's not just the generation, but it's how you deliver it to the grid, it's where you deliver it to the grid, because there are different prices of electricity in different parts of the grid. So if you're able to deliver effectively and efficiently to the highest price point, then you reduce the support that we're asking ratepayers to pay. It becomes much more affordable. So that's the kind of education we've been doing throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, so that policymakers understand that if they look in a more integrated way, they can get a much more successful industry.
Excellent. Don?
I think more than anything else, it's been the rhetoric that's been drawn as to the potential environmental impacts that aquaculture can have if it's not done properly. And we have ample regulatory control over how this would be undertaken in our own waters with significant public oversight. And I just believe that when people realize that taking control of it themselves and producing the food ourselves will create a much higher sense of security about what we're eating than to be reliant upon 50 or 60 different countries all over the globe. And when you think about, I mean, as much as many of us travel in our professional lives, to think that that chunk of salmon that you just had for dinner may have flown more than you did in the last year, that's got to say something about the potential carbon footprint of the way that we're getting our seafood now, that we can eliminate by creating a regional supply appropriate to our nation.
Martin, could you talk a little bit about the United States vis-a-vis other countries and around the world, how wind energy, offshore in particular, is being incorporated? I mean, are they more pro taking the kinds of steps you're talking about, or is the United States in the vanguard of this?
Oh, the United States not in the vanguard of offshore wind. In Europe, there's more than 3,000 megawatts of offshore wind installed, principally in the North Sea. And it's driven by a desire to promote economic development that way, but also to reduce their energy vulnerability. There have been more than one time in the past that Europe's access to natural gas, principally from Russia, has been curtailed, often during the winter when you want to stay warm. And that's led them to desire to be much more energy independent. When I mention that, people often say, well, America is not like Europe. We have big open spaces, etc. But the East Coast is actually a lot like Europe in the sense of very densely populated, not a lot of land available for conventional, for renewable technologies that are designed for land. So we have a lot in common with Europe on offshore wind.
John, I'm curious, you talked about transportation, you talked about American ingenuity. What did it look like in the historical context vis-a-vis other countries? Why did America develop so rapidly during that period of time? Is that an area that you focused on at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the American story, sort of the standard one, was that we excelled in maritime transportation for, into the first half of the 19th century in an age of wood. We lost that edge to some degree because of our because we had so many resources available, but it was easier to continue, using natural resources like wood to build ships. So we lost that edge. But if we look at the central part of the country, the story was very different. This process of creating an ocean was linked to industrialization, which changed this country, and so the same drives that led to new processes for steel, for new mills, for new production facilities, depended directly on better ways of supplying raw materials. And so innovation, both on land and on the water, were interlinked. And so you see extraordinarily rapid innovation from about 1870 to the beginning of the 20th century. And then something really interesting occurs, at least in the heartland of the United States. We developed technology and technological systems, because it is system-based, that were so suited to what we were doing, to producing heavy industry, that the systems didn't change in fundamental ways for almost a century. And it's disappearing now, but I've been out working on Lake Huron or Lake Michigan and watched 100-year-old commercial bulk carriers come cruising by, still in operation. And that's not because it's cute and antiquated. It's because what they developed was so efficient, so appropriate to the environment, to what we needed to do, that it was like nothing in the world. We can look at that region and we can see really the precursors of containerization and that level of efficiency, and so some good lessons to be seen there.
So for Joe and Don, Joe, you showed your last slide was about the traffic coming into Boston, and I think it was the accommodating whales so that traffic didn't get impacted, and at the same time we were doing what was right for nature. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about how that can be done, and if it's being done around the United States and around the world? And then, Don, I'd like to have you talk a little about the aquaculture and how you would accommodate the Navy and all the marine traffic around San Diego with the proposal that you had put forward.
Yeah, I think what's important, and Markin has spoken about this, is the rise of the ocean planning and coastal zone management. We know where whale populations are, for example, as you saw in that slide, by designing different regions to have the appropriate regions for, let's say, wind energy, which can be a net benefit to fisheries at times. It can also even help whale populations if it's put in the right place. It can also be a negative if it's put in the wrong place. I would say that is the way forward, is starting to look at those zones, and we see that happening in Massachusetts now, in California, and I hope that will be done on a federal level, that will start planning intelligently our coastal zones.
And just quickly, is that being done in Canada and other countries as well?
There are other countries that are doing it. I'm not as aware of it, but Massachusetts, at least here in the U.S., Massachusetts and California are in the lead.
Thank you. Hey, Don, could you talk about accommodating all the fishermen and the Navy and all the boats, and whether they were trying to collaborate with you and your program?
Certainly. I think Markin had a great slide on there showing the planning process they went through off of Cape Cod to look at different areas. And it comes down to, what do you need to do your job and what do you want to avoid specific to your need? So we said we want to be between 100 feet and 300 feet of depth. We want a quarter to a half knot of consistent current. We want to be away from sewage outfalls, harbor entrances, and river outfalls. So that gave us a lot of space to play with when you think about, that amount of area. Now, the next thing you start looking at is, well, you don't want to be interfering with aircraft carriers that are coming into San Diego Bay. That might be a problem. And you want to avoid where the SEAL team guys go and practice all the time. And then it gets down a little more specific, and you have to work with each kind of user group. You sit down with a commercial fisherman and you say, guys, here's the idea. We're thinking about this spot right here. And one fisherman in the group actually said, look, that's where I catch my boccaccio. So he said, well, how about if we shift it a quarter mile further south? And he goes, no problem. So that took care of that. We looked at the Coast Guard, and we said, we're thinking of putting it here. And they said, well, this is good because you come out of Mission Bay and you go left if you're going down to San Diego. If you're going to San Clemente Island, you take a bearing this way. If you go to Catalina, you take a bearing that way. And in between those was the farm site we were looking at. It was 5 miles out to sea, so it really wouldn't even be visible from land. So there wasn't much of an visual impairment either. So what it comes down to is you have to do some front-end thinking about what you need and then what you want to avoid and what you want to not conflict with. But it always comes down to picking a spot. Because when you go to get your Section 10 permit and your effluent permit and everything else, it's site-specific. But part of the process you go through is to tell them why this site was right. Why didn't you use that one a mile this way or that one a mile that way? And if you've gone through your spatial planning process properly, you've got the answers for that and make your NEPA certification a much stronger argument.
I'm going to open the floor up to questions at this point. If we could ask people to identify themselves when they ask a question. Down here in front, if we could. Provide a microphone.
Hi, thank you. My name's Fred Keeley. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of the Foundation. I used to serve in the California legislature with a person who served for a long time in Congress here named John Burton. John Burton had a saying about legislation which was accuracy first, speed second. And so my question's to Don about the slide that you showed about the processing time here versus in Mexico with regard to permitting. And I don't mean to be argumentative about it. I'm interested in what point you were trying to make, because it does seem that we have a compound, complex regulatory architecture and permitting architecture for a reason and for a whole bunch of reasons. And Mexico may have a different set of public policy architecture for how they go through it. So I'm wondering what the point of the slide was in terms of how long it takes here versus how long it takes in Mexico.
Well, the most basic point is, if you're going to start a seafood business and create a supply of seafood, and you sit down with an investor and say, I need $15 million to build this farm. Now, the farm's either going to be in Mexico, and it'll take me 6 months to get permission to do it, or I'm going to spend another $1 million and take 2 years to do it in the U.S. The investor is going to go, let's go to Mexico. We're importing 85% of our seafood. What's 86%? What's 87%? That process works. Now, the 2-year timeline was basically laid out as the formal process for NEPA certification with a parallel Section 10 permit from the Army Corps. They would be the lead agency. And then we were still working out, we requested from our Coastal Commission a consistency with the Coastal Act review. Now, are they going to do that consistent and be at the table and talk with everybody else, or do they want to do that consistency certification after the fact? It's a matter of how you stack these things together, and it really works to get everybody around the table at the same time, so that the concern the Navy has and the concern that the EPA has isn't something that gets duplicated in another way by a different agency. It's the reality of the situation. I wasn't damning it so much as just pointing out that it takes away a competitive edge in our nation, because and what they do in Mexico is they actually have a programmatic EIR, in effect, based on the existing tuna farms that they have as a cause of study. One of the difficult things is the uncertainty, what we don't know about aquaculture. So by having a farm out there, the first guy that does it, that demonstrates that he isn't harming the environment, that uneaten food is piling up on the bottom, that sort of thing, is going to make the next effort to do it that much simpler, because we'll have hard empirical data that's been analyzed over time that leads us to feel much more comfortable with the process. Right now, everybody kind of feels it's a black box, except for Washington State and Maine, where you're able to put salmon farms in, and there's a set process for doing that. I guess my other point with that would be that this industry is not going to grow overnight. When you think about a 3,000-ton farm, think of that as 3 million fish grown to a kilo. Well, we have the only hatchery on the west coast of the United States capable of even coming close to that in production, and we do it for enhancing the wild stock of white sea bass. That would be a full year's production for us to crank out that many fish. So when the industry is in place, and we then know that, hey, let's go beyond 3,000 tons, let's go to 10,000 tons, somebody's going to have to build a 10 million fish hatchery somewhere in the coastal zone that's going to have to go through its whole environmental review process. And so there's going to be a stepwise progression in the growth of the industry that's really keyed around the infrastructure being made available. Right now, what we have is Mexico with cages available in the water, but no hatchery infrastructure. So they're the folks that are really interested in what we know how to do from a juvenile fish production side. And what we're hoping to do is use Mexico as the demonstration where we can collect that empirical data and come back and say, this is what's going on under cages in Mexico. Now let's see what would happen if we were to model that 5 miles off of San Francisco or San Diego or LA or wherever.
Let's see if we can get some other questions for other panelists up here. Yes? Why don't we try and get some other questions and then come back to aquaculture? Yes, Ann?
Mine's not really about, it's not the aquaculture directly, but I'm curious if there's, you don't want to locate your site near a sewage outfall. Is there some part of that partnership bringing everyone to the table to talk about influencing watershed activities and policies within the watersheds that are impacting our coastal waters that would, be a positive benefit to the coastal community and aquaculture, I guess?
Well, I don't know how much standing an aquaculturist would have at the table if he doesn't actually have a facility that might be impacted by the discharge of a sewage treatment plant. It's a fairly complex issue. In San Diego, we actually were supposed to go to a tertiary treatment, got a variance from it. So the politics of sewage treatment is heavily already involved. And there's plenty of space out in the ocean if we just stay away from those locations and avoid them. I was on a water quality board for the mayor of San Diego. There's all kinds of ways we can influence ourselves as have influence as experts and as concerned citizens that doesn't have to come back to one industry that doesn't exist right now. So,
question in the back.
Yeah, Kip Knutson. I work for Alaska Governor Sean Parnell in his D.C. office. So interesting context. We have the historians who discussed unfettered access to the oceans, and then a couple of practitioners interested in using the oceans today. I'm just curious, what are the opinions about national ocean policy? How would an ocean policy help aquaculture, wind farms, and then limiting the unfettered? Can you just talk to us about the benefits? We're struggling a little bit in Alaska to see how stacking on top of NEPA and everything else, another process is actually going to help the oceans. Thank you.
Yeah, just briefly, I did trod the halls of Congress in support of the National Ocean Policy. We see early collaboration about users and their different interests and trying to resolve those through policy discussions as a way to give certainty to projects and help them move forward.
I'd like to take a little bit of a stab at that as well, given the Alaskan context. And I've been involved in the National Ocean Policy through Marine Spatial Planning, but thinking about the Alaska context, some of the things about the National Ocean Policy is it's in a way trying to implement or foster ideas that Alaska embraced over 50 years ago in the Constitution, which had to do with sustainability and use and recognizing the long-term investment we all have in the environment. And so I think it actually helps that by making that visible. And so I think in the end it would be helpful to Alaska. You have so much space that perhaps it's you're not going to run into the same sets of problems that we have in Rhode Island, where we have done marine spatial planning. But I think it's consistent with what Alaska has done actually. And that was brought up there, so that's why I'm pointing that out.
And Michael, you had asked if there were any international examples. One good one, I think, is the work that's being done in Australia and the Great Barrier Reef. They've done an exemplary job of allowing for extraction in some areas, putting marine protected areas in others, allowing multiple uses, a possible way forward for the U.S. as well to look at that model.
Australia's been very innovative in almost all areas of marine industry. They're big users of aquaculture. They have gone into desalination in a major way. There is no system integrator of desal plants in the United States today. In fact, the only plant that's being built right now in Carlsbad is going to be built by an Israeli company because there are no manufacturers of U.S. plants. The Australians, the Spanish, the Israelis are some of the biggest in the world. We do a lot of the technology, but we don't actually put the plants together. In Australia, because they've been building plants, they have a very vibrant technology industry and system integration business. So they've been very active in all aspects of maritime technology. Other questions? Over here?
I had a question about the Atlantic Wind connection, and I understand, I think construction is supposed to begin in the next year or two, and yet attempts to site large-scale offshore wind farms, for instance, off the coast of Delaware, have really stalled out recently. And so I was wondering how willing you think investors are still going to be to front the capital cost without guaranteed purchase power agreements from large-scale offshore wind farms.
You need to have transmission infrastructure available for wind farms to connect. We can't have it the other way around where investments, very large investments, are made in wind farms and they don't have the transmission infrastructure to get that power to shore. So we are trying to be on the front end. We've probably got a good 1.5 to 2 years of permitting still ahead of us. We did have a milestone recently where it was determined that there was no need to hold an auction for the offshore lease that we needed, or the right-of-way grant. But we've still got a good deal of permitting ahead and fairly long manufacturing and construction process. So there's time for the wind farms to catch up.
Do we have time for one more question? Okay, we have 3 minutes. Lady, here.
I noticed that one of the assumptions on the aqua farms was that the 30-foot for the pens, 30-foot wave. You mentioned what happens in the instance of a rogue wave and what kind of risks are associated with air. What was the basis for the 30-foot?
Well, we have direct experience with this cage technology in hurricanes off of New England, actually. The first open ocean cage in the U.S. was set up for the New England Aquarium to hold tuna for display. And that went through a hurricane and did just fine, 90-mile-an-hour winds and 30-foot waves. The situation we have in Southern California is because of the shape of the coastline and the shadow created by the Channel Islands. A 15-foot swell is really uncommon. It's the type of the maximum size we ever see there. My point was that wherever you're going to do this, you need to do it to fit the climate and fit the conditions of the area. That's why a lot of people like putting their cages, like the Mediterranean. You may have seen that one picture on there where it's tucked back into a cove. When you tuck it back in a cove like that, you end up not getting the type of flushing you want to keep the water as clean as you want it to be. So you want to get it out into an open current area. So I don't know if I answered your question, but there are other cages that are available too that can be submerged and drop down below the water surface. The disadvantage of those in Southern California is fish grow according to temperature. In the warm months, if you drop them down 30 feet, they're below the thermocline, so they don't grow very fast. So you want to keep them up in the upper regions during the warm parts of the year.
I think with that, I'm going to just try and summarize. I think your comment from gentleman from Alaska and what you're looking at, you may said, as you said, the historians were talking about unfettered use of the ocean, and then talking about how we've dealt with the whale or dealt with transportation over some period of time. But at the beginning, there wasn't a lot of rules and regulations. And now we've got two industries. And if we care about food for the world, if we care about water for the world, desalination, if we care about new medicines, biomedicines from the sea, if we care about large floating platforms, we care about energy ocean, all of these are compromises. We're either going to try and do it on land because people want their oil or they want their energy or they want their medicine, or we're going to have to do it with the ocean. And doing it with people that are trying to do it on a sustainable basis, environmentally friendly, I think is one of the things that we've got to grapple with as a country. And to your point about the ocean policy, it's I don't know enough about the policy itself, but I think it's very important that we have the dialogue. And again, I'll just end by saying that I think it's fabulous the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation has put this kind of a panel together. There are obviously strong beliefs. If you believe in or don't believe in aquaculture, or you believe in offshore wind energy or you don't, you know, if the whales are going to bump into it. I mean, there's all kinds of issues that we're going to have to deal with. But at the end of the day, the ocean is such a big portion of this earth, and there are so many people that live out there that we either have to decide how we're going to feed them and take care of them and do it in a way that our country continues to be prosperous, or we will find that getting out 10 and 20 years, we've got issues we didn't want to deal with. So with that, I'm going to say this was a great panel. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking the panel.